The path to the empty house. I never believed in legends. They're just stories stitched together by bored minds, passed down until they harden into something that feels like truth. But truth has a way of warping when you look at it too long. That's what happened to us. That's why I'm the only one left to tell you what the hell happened in those woods. It started as a joke, really. A drunken idea thrown around at a party, let's go find the empty house. Everyone in our town had heard of it, some forgotten structure deep in the Appalachian woods, a place that lured people in and never let them go. The kind of story you hear as a kid to keep you from wandering too far from home. But we weren't kids anymore. We were 5 reckless idiots who thought we were invincible. Me, Cody, Jess, Brent, and Tasha. We packed light, just enough supplies for a weekend hike, and set out at sunrise. The directions were vague: head north past the old fire road, follow the creek until the water runs dry, and keep walking. You'll know when you're close, the stories said. The air will feel wrong. That should have been our first clue to turn back. The first day was uneventful, just miles of dense forest, the smell of damp earth, and the distant calls of birds. It wasn't until late afternoon that we noticed the silence. No birds. No rustling leaves. Just our own footsteps crunching against the dirt. Guess we're getting close, Brent joked, but no one laughed. We set up camp just off the path, our fire a small, flickering thing against the looming trees. Jess pulled out her phone, frowning. No service. That wasn't surprising, but the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Something about the way the shadows stretched too long around us, the way the air felt thick, like wading through syrup. We should have left then. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Not animal, not the rhythmic crunch of deer or the skitter of a raccoon. Human. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, listening. They circled our tents once. Twice. Then stopped. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Minutes dragged into an hour, and still, I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion won. I told myself it was just my imagination. But in the morning, we found footprints around our tents. Bare footprints. Jess wanted to leave. We've seen enough, she said, but the rest of us weren't ready to turn back. We'd come too far. The footprints could have been from another hiker, right? Some local messing with us? We convinced ourselves of that and kept walking. By noon, we saw it. The empty house. It sat at the edge of a clearing, its wood warped and rotting, the windows gaping black holes. It didn't look special, just another abandoned relic swallowed by time. But something about it made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean away from it, or how the ground around it was barren, as if nothing dared to grow too close. Cody was the first to step forward. Come on, he said, grinning. Let's check it out. The rest of us hesitated, but curiosity always wins. We followed him to the porch, the wood creaking beneath our weight. The door was ajar, swinging slightly even though there was no wind. Tasha hesitated. We don't have to go in, she muttered. But we did. And the second we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us. We froze. The door slamming could have been the wind, if there had been wind. But inside the house, the air felt stale, thick with the scent of rotting wood and something metallic, like old blood. Dust floated in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows. Cody tried the door handle. It wouldn't budge. Locked, he muttered, rattling it harder. Jess backed away, pressing herself against the wall. This was a mistake. The house was silent. No echoes, no settling wood, just an unnatural stillness that made the fine hairs on my arms rise. Brent pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The walls were bare except for deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had clawed at them. Furniture was overturned, rotting away in the corners. The place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but there were footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. Tasha swore under her breath. Let's just find another way out. We moved deeper inside, searching for another exit. That's when the layout stopped making sense. The first hallway led us to a staircase that twisted upward into darkness. When we turned to backtrack, the entryway was gone. I mean, completely gone. The space where we had just walked in now opened into another hallway, stretching impossibly long, its wallpaper peeling in thick, curling strips. Jess whimpered. No. No, 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 she turned and bolted down the hall. Jess. Wait. Cody ran after her. The rest of us followed, our footsteps echoing too loud in the dead air. The hallway twisted, leading into a series of doorways, each one opening into another identical corridor. The further we ran, the more the walls seemed to shift, the angles warping as if the house were breathing, stretching itself into something unnatural. Brent grabbed my arm. We need to stay together. Then, suddenly, Jess screamed. We skidded to a stop. The sound was sharp, raw, full of something that made my stomach lurch. We ran toward it, but when we turned the next corner, Jess was gone. The hallway ended at a single door. It was slightly open, darkness yawning beyond. Cody shoved past us and pushed the door fully open. The room inside wasn't a room at all. It was impossible. A vast, black expanse stretched beyond the doorway, stars scattered like shattered glass across a void. The air smelled different, colder, like deep water. And in the middle of that nothingness, Jess stood, unmoving. Her back was to us, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Jess. I stepped forward, but Brent yanked me back. Don't. Cody ignored him. He grabbed the doorframe, leaning inside. Jess, come on. She didn't move. Then, so fast I barely saw it, something shifted in the dark behind her. A ripple, like a curtain stirring in a breeze. And then Jess turned. Or, no. Her body turned, but her face didn't. It stayed fixed in place, her features stretching, distorting as if her skin were made of melting wax. And then, one by one, her eyes blinked out. Not closed, just gone, swallowed into the void. Cody screamed. Brent yanked him back, and the door slammed shut. The hallway around us flickered, the light overhead buzzing like a dying bulb. When it stabilized, the door was gone. Just another stretch of peeling wallpaper. Tasha was crying, her hands clamped over her mouth. This isn't real, she whispered. It's not real. But it was. And we weren't getting out. We stood there, panting, as the silence wrapped around us, thick and suffocating. Cody was trembling, his hand still gripping the empty space where the door had been, his fingers curled into a tight fist. His face was pale, his breath shallow, and his eyes were wide with something worse than fear. He had seen something we hadn't, something in that void that had peeled back the last layer of his disbelief and left him raw. Brent grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him hard. Get it together. We need to move. His voice was steady, but there was something brittle in it, something that threatened to crack if pressed too hard. Tasha wiped at her face with shaking hands, leaving streaks of dust across her cheeks. We can't stay here. We can't just stand here. But where the hell were we supposed to go? The house had shifted again, the hallway ahead of us was no longer the same one we had run through just moments before. The walls seemed to bow inward, pressing closer, the light fixtures above us buzzing faintly, flickering just enough to make the shadows dance. There were no windows, no doors, only a single corridor stretching forward, narrowing slightly as if leading into the throat of something vast and waiting. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to move. One step. Then another. The others followed, slow, hesitant, as if we were walking straight into a trap, but couldn't do anything else. The floor creaked beneath us, the wood soft in places, sagging under our weight. The air smelled damp now, like mold and something older, something forgotten. The deeper we went, the heavier it felt, pressing down on our lungs, making every breath a little harder to take. Then the hallway split. Two paths, both identical, stretching away into dimness. The light above us flickered again, and for a fraction of a second, I swore I saw something shift in the left corridor, something dark, slithering just beyond the reach of the dim glow. I took a step back, my stomach turning over. Not that way. Brent frowned. Why? I didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. I just knew. The way an animal knows when the ground is about to give way beneath it, the way you sometimes wake in the middle of the night with your heart pounding and no memory of what startled you awake. Tasha didn't argue. She turned toward the right passage without hesitation, and we followed. The corridor twisted sharply, the wallpaper becoming more tattered, the wooden floorboards beneath us shifting subtly, almost as if they weren't entirely solid. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, so soft I thought it was just the sound of our own footsteps. But as we walked, they grew louder, overlapping, dozens of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I couldn't make out the words, but they filled the air, surrounding us, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Cody's breath hitched. Tell me you hear that. Tasha nodded, her face drawn tight. We need to get out of this hallway. No. But the corridor stretched on. The walls on either side of us seemed to lean inward, the ceiling lowering just slightly, enough to make it feel as if we were being funneled into something. The whispers turned to murmurs, the sound rising and falling in an eerie, rhythmic pattern, like a chant just on the edge of understanding. Then, movement. Not ahead of us. Not behind us. Beneath us. The floor buckled. Brent swore and lunged for the nearest wall, his fingers digging into the peeling wallpaper. I felt the boards shift under my feet, the wood suddenly soft, giving way like wet paper. The sound of splintering filled the corridor, sharp cracks splitting through the murmurs, and then, all at once, the floor collapsed beneath us. We plunged into darkness. The world seemed to collapse around me. There was no sound but the rushing wind in my ears and the sudden, sickening lurch of falling. My stomach hitched as the floor vanished entirely, and for a split second, I felt weightless, suspended in some empty, void-like space. Then, a sharp impact. Pain. I gasped, my body jerking as I hit something solid, hard, unforgiving stone. My limbs sprawled out in every direction, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air smelled damp and rank, like the inside of a tomb, thick and oppressive. I forced myself to sit up, coughing as dust filled my lungs. Cody? Tasha's voice cracked, panicked. I could hear her struggling to get to her feet, her breath quick and ragged. I'm fine, came Cody's voice, distant, sounding hollow. Just, hold on. I managed to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me, the floor beneath my feet slick with something wet. I brushed my hands against the rough stone wall beside me, the texture gritty and cold. The dim light from the hallway above us had faded, leaving us in near total darkness, save for a faint glow that seemed to pulse from somewhere deeper below. Where are we? Tasha whispered. I don't know. I felt around, my fingers grazing the edges of some large, jagged structure. But it's not. The ground shifted again. A soft tremor, subtle but enough to unsettle me. I froze, waiting for it to stop, but the trembling deepened, vibrating through the stone beneath us. The walls groaned, and I felt an odd pull toward the source of that pulsing glow, like something was calling us, luring us deeper into whatever this place was. We shouldn't move, Brent said, his voice tight with unease. We don't know what this place is. But I couldn't stay still. The pull was too strong. Something inside me, something primal and desperate, urged me forward. I took a step, then another, my hands reaching out in front of me as I slowly made my way toward the light. I wasn't the only one moving. Behind me, Cody followed, his footsteps barely audible in the thick silence. Tasha was hesitant, her voice barely a whisper. Wait, we shouldn't be here. We should go back. Back to what? I shot back, my voice harsh. There is no going back. She didn't answer. The glow intensified as we moved, and soon we found ourselves in a cavernous chamber, vast and silent. The walls curved upward, disappearing into blackness, and the floor was covered in a slick, wet substance that made every step feel treacherous. In the center of the room, an altar of some kind sat, carved from the same stone that surrounded us. The light emanated from it, faint and sickly, as if it were alive, breathing in the dark. I stepped closer, drawn like a moth to a flame, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more I felt the air shift, the temperature dropping, as if the room itself were holding its breath. My fingers brushed against the surface of the altar. Cold. The whispers returned, louder this time. They surrounded us, not from any one direction, but everywhere, rising like a crescendo. My head spun, the words incoherent, but there was a thread of urgency in them, something desperate and pleading. Then, suddenly, the light flickered. Everything went black. For a moment, I thought we were back in the hallway, or maybe we had never left it at all. But when the light returned, flickered on, just long enough to illuminate the space around us, I realized something had changed. The altar was gone. The room, once enormous and cavernous, now seemed smaller, claustrophobic. The walls had closed in, creeping closer, pressing us together in the center of the space. The floor beneath us shifted again, the slick, wet surface becoming something softer, spongier, like wet earth. And that's when I saw it. A door. Not just any door. It was large, ornate, its frame twisted with symbols I couldn't read, symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them. The wood was dark and worn, but it had a weight to it, an oppressive presence. We need to leave. Now. Cody's voice was trembling. He was on the edge of panic, and I didn't blame him. The door was the only way forward. The only way out. But I felt it, the same pulse, the same pull that had brought us here. It wasn't just a door. It was something more. I reached for the handle. My fingers brushed against it, but the second I touched it, I felt a jolt, a shock of cold that shot up my arm. The door creaked, then groaned, as if something were trying to force its way through from the other side. Brent grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back. Don't. But it was too late. The door swung open, and beyond it, nothing. An endless void stretched beyond the frame, a blackness so deep and vast that I couldn't comprehend it. And then, from that blackness, a shape began to form. A figure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it moved toward us. The figure stepped into the faint light, its form slowly becoming more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body contorting unnaturally as if it were a shadow trying to manifest itself in the real world. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its eyes, those unseen eyes, piercing through me, reading every thought, every fear that had ever lived in my mind. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but the figure did not move toward us, at least not directly. It just stood there, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The air around it thickened, the atmosphere becoming heavier with each passing second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. All I could do was stare at it, frozen in place. Get the hell back, Cody whispered urgently, but his voice was thin, desperate, barely a whisper against the oppressive silence that surrounded us. He reached for my arm, pulling me away, but the weight of that figure in the doorway held me in place, rooted to the spot. What is that? Tasha breathed, her voice shaking. What the hell is that? I couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come, and even if they did, they would have been useless. We were trapped. Trapped in this room with that thing. The figure didn't move. It didn't have to. The very air around it seemed to vibrate with energy, an ancient, primal force that twisted the very fabric of reality itself. It was the house, or whatever lay behind it. This was the lure, the trap, the reason we had come. It wanted us. Needed us. and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble again, more violently this time. The walls creaked and groaned, their stone surfaces cracking, as if the house itself was coming alive, shifting, adapting. The door was no longer a portal to some other place. It was a gateway, and that figure, that thing, was merely its keeper. The whispering started again. Louder now, impossible to ignore, as if the voices were coming from within us, from the very marrow of our bones. I could hear my name. I could hear Brent's, Tasha's, Cody's. They were calling to us, begging us to step closer, to surrender. No one moved. We stood frozen in the shadows of the figure, our faces pale, our eyes wide with terror. No one spoke, but we didn't need to. The terror was mutual, shared, a silent understanding that we were no longer in control of our fate. The house was the one in charge now, and it would do with us whatever it wished. The air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine, freezing me to the core. I looked to my left, to Tasha, to Cody, to Brent. But no one was there. They had disappeared. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was alone. The figure began to move then. Its body elongated, stretched toward me, its presence growing larger, more imposing with every second. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The air was thick with dread, suffocating me, crushing me under its weight. It was like being submerged underwater, unable to surface, unable to breathe. It reached for me, its hand like a twisted, clawed shadow. I could feel the darkness pulling at my skin, dragging me toward it. My feet left the ground, and I was weightless again, but not in a freeing sense. I was being drawn toward something that wanted me, that needed me, something beyond comprehension. And then, in a split second, it all stopped. The trembling ceased. The whispers faded. The figure was gone. I was back. Back at the edge of the house. But something had changed. The doorway was no longer there. The altar had vanished. And the house, once imposing, now stood silent, abandoned, empty, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew that the house hadn't given up. It had just shifted, just like the rooms inside, just like the time we had lost. It was waiting for us to come back. Waiting for the next group of fools to wander in, to be swallowed whole. To become part of its endless, twisting puzzle. And I realized, finally, that the house would never let us leave. Not really. No one ever leaves.